Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I'm Margaret Mims from the Department of Learning and Interpretation here at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. Today, we continue our lectures in celebration of the extraordinary exhibition that opened on Sunday, March the 10th, Vincent van Gogh, His Life in Art. Today is the third of 5 lectures in the 43rd Annual Ruth K. Shuttle Lecture Series, an annual series of lectures sometimes all offered in the past on the same day as a day-long symposium, but more recently we've been offering them as a series of lectures spread out over a couple of months as we're doing now, which I think is a little more manageable for all of us. But all of them are funded through the enormous generosity of the Brown Foundation, Inc., incorporated here in Houston, and I really, on behalf of the museum, want to give the Brown Foundation a big round of applause from all of us. 43 years is a real commitment. They were established in 1975 by Alice Pratt Brown, whose name is on one of the gallery buildings here and on many things here at this museum. Alice Pratt Brown served 26 terms as a trustee of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and she established the Ruth K. Shuttle Lectures or Symposium to honor the memory of her friend, Ruth Shuttle, who was also a longtime museum benefactor. So this series of lectures features a who's who of renowned scholars of Van Gogh's life and his work. Our first speaker was Nienke Bakker, the senior curator at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, who lives and breathes literally Van Gogh every single day. Her talk focused on how Van Gogh's reputation as a pioneer of modern art was firmly established during the decade following his death in 1890. Then in our second lecture, Gloria Groom from the Art Institute of Chicago talked about an exhibition that she organized just 3 years ago that reunited the 3 different versions of Van Gogh that Van Gogh painted of his bedroom in the Yellow House in Arles. One version, of course, being in the collection of the Art Institute, another at the Van Gogh Museum, and the third at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And what Gloria Groom talked about were the many new insights that having these paintings together again revealed about the significance of the bedroom as a motif for Van Gogh, a place of refuge for him, a nesting place, a creative chamber, and of course, a physical reality. Now, upcoming next Saturday, also at 4 o'clock, George Shackelford, a deputy director at the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, will address the topic, Starry Nights, Sunny Days, Van Gogh in Provence. And then we'll conclude our series the following week on Saturday, April 13th, when Louis Van Tilburg, the senior researcher at the Van Gogh Museum, will talk about Van Gogh's fascination with 19th century Japanese woodblock prints and how they became a benchmark for his work. So if you can, please join us. And if you'd like to watch some of the Shuttle lectures again, just so you know, we have the first one currently online, Nienke Bakker's lecture, so you can, I'm not saying that it's broadcast television, but the sound is good and you'll be able to watch it. It's not, you know, it's serviceable. It's on YouTube. So the way you get there is you Google YouTube, go to YouTube, open YouTube, and at the top there's a little search bar and you just type in 2 words, MFAH for Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and then the word docents. Then you click enter and up will come this channel full of pages of full of videos that you can watch. Now they're not all about, obviously they're more than just Van Gogh. There's some about Sally Mann and other exhibitions on there. So we post these on this little YouTube channel so the docents can review the material for their tours. But now you know how to access them, and maybe someday we'll have them on the museum's website, but at least for now that's our venue where we can put them out online, which is what we told the Brown Foundation that we would do. So today, back to our subject, we bring Van Gogh very close to home as our focus is his painting, The Rocks, which is part of the John and Audrey Jones Beck collection of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist art here at the Museum of Fine Arts. Painted in 1888, it depicts a lone oak tree, bent and twisted by the winds, standing on an outcropping of rocks. I'm more than delighted this afternoon to welcome Dr. David Bomford as our speaker. Dr. Bomford is chief of the Department of Conservation here at the Museum of Fine Arts, and also the Audrey Jones Beck Curator of European Art here at the museum. And it was Dr. Bomford who organized and brought us the exhibition Vincent van Gogh, His Life in Art. Dr. Bomford has been a distinguished figure in the field of conservation science for more than 40 years, serving as senior restorer at the National Gallery in London and as Secretary General of the International Institute for Conservation. At the National Gallery, he worked on many of the great masterworks of Western art, including Van Gogh's Sunflowers and many works by Rembrandt. Now, in 2012, he came out of retirement to join the staff of our museum to construct a new state-of-the-art facility for the museum's conservation department, the department charged with the care and upkeep of the thousands of works in the museum's ever-expanding collections of paintings, photographs, sculptures, decorative arts, furniture, etc. Those new labs were completed last fall. At the same time that he was overseeing the new conservation facility, Dr. Bomford has been just as active in his curatorial role, bringing us one exceptional exhibition after another, starting with Spectacular Rubens shortly after he arrived, which showcased 4 monumental tapestries from a series of 20 designed by the great early 17th century Baroque painter Peter Paul Rubens. Then the exhibition Habsburg Splendor, masterpieces from Vienna's imperial collections, which filled the massive gallery on the upper level of this building with masterpiece paintings and rare objects from the collection of the emperors of the long-running Habsburg dynasty. And then last fall, he organized the exhibition Tudors to Windsors, British royal portraits from Holbein to Warhol, an exhibition that presented a grand, sweeping survey of the kings, queens, princes, and princesses who've graced the British crown from the late 15th century to the present day. And of course now, he brings us Vincent van Gogh, His Life in Art, an exhibition that has enjoyed non-stop crowds since the day it opened, and which is why it was so hard for you to park today. But now please join me in welcoming Dr. David Bomford to the lectern to talk about our very own painting by Vincent van Gogh, The Rocks.
Thank you, Margaret, very much indeed. I'm especially privileged to present this lecture today because it's Vincent van Gogh's birthday. He was born on this day 166 years ago, so happy birthday, Vincent. I'm going to talk about his time in Arles, and the center of my topic is going to be the Houston painting of the rocks, as Margaret mentioned. But he was in Arles, in Provence, from the 20th of February, 1888, until the 8th of May, 1889, which is exactly 444 days. And in that time, he produced some 200 paintings, some 100 drawings, and over 200 letters, all of which still survive. So it's an extraordinary accomplishment. And his time in Arles, this 15 months in Arles, represents the great flowering of his career. He produced his greatest work in Arles. He produced masterpieces after Arles, like The Starry Night and Wheatfield with Cypresses, but many of the great works that we regard as his standout masterpieces were produced in Arles. This is The Rocks, which I'm going to be coming back to in the middle of the lecture. And this is the painting from the Audrey Jones Beck collection here in the Museum of Fine Arts, about which I wish to construct a context a little later on. As Margaret mentioned, it depicts a lone oak tree on a rocky hillside, and we know the location of this. It's an area called Montmajour, which is just to the north of Arles, the northeast of Arles, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But essentially, he went to this hillside frequently and made a great deal of studies, a great number of studies, and a pair of paintings, including our version of The Rocks. So he arrived in Arles on the 20th of February, 1888, and I just want to sketch out some of the main points of Arles because we're going to be seeing his paintings of these locations as we go through. The famous one is the Yellow House, which was his great studio house, which he shared with Paul Gauguin. The Café de la Gare, the famous night cafe, which we're going to see. The hotel restaurant Carrel, which was where he stayed when he first arrived in Arles. The Place Lamartine is where the Yellow House is located, and the Avenue de Montmajour up there is where he would have walked out of Arles to get to the hill of Montmajour, which we will see again. Then coming down, we have the house of Dr. Ray, who treated him when he had his great breakdown at the end of his time in Arles. We have the hospital called the Hôtel Dieu, which was the hospital which he painted when he was a patient there. And we have down here the Langlois Bridge, a famous bridge over a canal off the Rhone River being the great river that runs through the town of Arles. It's a Roman town. It has a Roman theatre, it has an arena, and it has an old Roman burial ground called Les Aliscons down here. Vincent walked around all those locations and painted many of them. So that locates ourself in the town of Arles. He arrived in February 1888 from Paris. He'd been living in Paris with his brother Theo, and he'd spent the time from 1886 until 1888 in Paris, absorbing Impressionism, absorbing Pointillism, seeing the avant-garde painters at work, and really acting like a sort of sponge, soaking up all the styles and all the influences of the famous painters like Monet, like Toulouse-Lautrec, like Seurat, and basically absorbing them into his repertoire. But he arrived in Provence in February, expecting it to be warm and in southern France, and it was the coldest winter in 60 years. And so he wrote to Theo, as he did almost every day, and said, it's been snowing here, it's extraordinary. But I've been out and I've painted 3 canvases already, and these are the 3 he painted. So he actually painted a snowy landscape here in February 1888, where he's walked outside the town and he's looking back at the town in this beautiful sunny winter's day. And this is probably some sort of bird hide where people would hide to observe birds on this sort of marshy area here. He said also in that letter to Theo, I've painted a view of a butcher's shop with a little piece of sidewalk in front of it. This is the very painting that he's referring to in that letter. And then he said, I've painted a portrait of an old Arlesienne woman. And this is the old Arlesienne woman he painted. She's called Elizabeth Garcin, and she is the mother-in-law of the proprietor of the first hotel he stayed in. That Hotel Carrel, which I pointed out on the map, was where he rented a room when he first arrived in Arles, and this was the mother-in-law of the proprietor. The snow soon went away. The weather warmed up. He loved the landscapes around Arles. He went there because he thought it would remind him of Japan. He was obsessed with Japanese prints and Japanese sensibilities. And of course, when he saw all the blossoms, all the peach trees in blossom, it reminded him even more of his ideal of Japan. And in March and April of 1888, he went out and he painted orchards full of peach blossom. And this was the most wonderful beginning to his time in Arles. And here you see the one on the left. He painted at the very end of March 1888. And he wrote to he wrote to his sister Will here. Here, for instance, at this moment, I have 6 paintings of blossoming fruit trees. And the one I brought home today would possibly appeal to you. It's a dug-over patch of ground in an orchard, a wicker fence, and 2 peach trees in full bloom, pink against a sparkling blue sky with white clouds and in sunshine. You may well see it, since I've decided to send this one to Jet Mauve. I've written on it. And Jet Mauve was his cousin, a woman who was married to the famous Dutch painter Anton Mauve, who had just died. And Vincent had got news of this beloved painter's death, the painter who taught him to paint in the first place in The Hague. And he wanted to send this painting to Mauve's widow as a remembrance of the painter that he admired so much. And so he wrote on the canvas here, Souvenir de Mauve, Vincent. It was a commemorative painting that he would send to the widow. Now, Vincent was not painting alone in Arles. He often had other painters passing through the town who he would join up with, who he would strike up brief friendships with. And one of them was a Danish painter called Christian Morier Petersen, and he was painting with Vincent at this very same spot at the very same moment. This is the same scene, seen from a slightly different angle. These are the same two trees here, but obviously Morier Petersen is sitting just slightly to the right of Vincent. Vincent was very friendly towards him, but wrote in his letter to Theo, well, he's rather timid and tentative, and I don't really like his style very much. But you can see the difference in their approach. Vincent's sort of really extraordinary, powerful, robust style, and Morier Petersen's rather careful, rather timid approach, as Vincent had said. So Morier Petersen was around in Arles for several months, and they would often walk together and paint together. So Vincent had other painters around. He wasn't just there on his own. Here are more flowering orchards that he painted in April of 1888. And the one on the right he painted as a birthday present for Theo. And he says here, croquis, which means sketch here of an orchard that I had especially intended for you to mark the 1st of May. That's Theo's birthday. It's entirely bright and done entirely in one go, a riot of impastos barely tinged with yellow and lilac in the first white clump. You'll probably be in Holland by then, and over there you'll see the same trees in blossom on that day. And this is the very letter that he writes to Theo with a little sketch, as he often did in his letters, of the composition that he was working on. And because it's a black and white sketch, he writes in colours so that Theo can imagine the painting. And of course he did send this eventually to Theo. He sent Theo batches of paintings quite regularly, and he used to take them off their stretchers and just put them all together in a pile, roll them up, and send them to Theo, who would then re-stretch them on their stretchers when they arrived in Paris, where Theo was living. And so quite often these paintings are not entirely dry, and so we see the impression of the canvas on top pressed into the impasto of the canvas underneath. So quite often, if you look at Van Gogh paintings, they have this sort of canvas weave impression on the tops of the paints. And he also painted in May of 1888 various views around the town. So he would step outside the town like he had with that snow scene that we saw earlier and paint the scene looking back towards the town. And spring is in full bloom. He says, a meadow full of very yellow buttercups, a ditch with iris plants with green leaves, with purple flowers, the town in the background, some grey willow trees, a strip of blue sky. And here again he makes a little drawing of his composition, which he sends to Theo on May the 12th, 1888. These letters are astonishing. They tell us what he was doing every day of his life when he writes a letter. So we've been able to chart the activities of Vincent van Gogh more fully than any other painter in the history of art. And this is one of the very early occasions on which he paints irises. So here we have a recurring motif of Vincent. He loved irises, and here they are in this ditch in May of 1888 with Arles in the background. And he walked down to the southwest to that bridge over the canal, the Langlois Bridge, this little canal off the Rhone. And it was called the Langlois Bridge. It had a proper local name, but the keeper of the bridge was Monsieur Langlois, and so it was named after him. And this is a wonderful composition. He painted the bridge 4 times. He often returned to motifs again and again and painted them over and over again. And we know that he constructed this composition using a perspective frame that he looked through and charted the different sectors of the perspective frame on the canvas itself. Technical photographs have revealed that there's a sort of little drawn framework underneath, which is actually used to create his composition. And so here he is in May 1888, still roaming around the town itself. He's not really ventured very far, but he's started to go outside the town. And so here's a map of Arles on the Rhone, which we saw just now. And then just to the northeast is the Abbey of Montmajour. Just to the south east of that is the Mont des Cordes there. To the northeast of that is Fontvieille, which is the sort of artist village where a lot of foreign artists would come and stay and paint because it was very picturesque around there. To the north of that we have the Alpilles, a low range of mountains which feature in the back of many of Van Gogh's landscapes. And just over the Alpilles is Saint-Remy, where he would enter the psychiatric hospital the following year. So this locates everything within that region. To the due north of Arles is Tarascon, which we'll come to in a moment. And down to the south on the Mediterranean Sea is a fishing village called Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer. And we'll see paintings of all of those shortly. And this whole plain, which extends to the south of the Alpilles Mountains, is called La Crau. And so we're going to see lots of extensive views across this plain, both from high and from low vantage points. And he first discovered the Abbey of Montmajour in March, but he didn't paint it or draw it then. He just said, I've been there. It's a very interesting place. Writing to Theo, he says, I've been on several hikes around here, but the wind has made it impossible to do anything. You've got to remember that painting in the open air, en plein air, is a very difficult thing to do because wind whips your canvas, it vibrates it, it makes the things fly around, and blows insects and grains of sand, if you're on the beach, onto your canvas. So you're very conscious of the fact that he's at the mercy of the elements. The sky was a hard blue with a great bright sun that melted just about all the snow. The snow is just going away in March, early March of 1888. But the wind was so cold and dry it gave you goose pimples. But even so, I've seen lots of beautiful things. A ruined abbey on a hill planted with hollies, pines and grey olive trees. And that ruined abbey is the Abbey of Montmajour, to which we will come back in just a moment. Later on, when he was walking out there more regularly, he was accompanied by this man, whom he called the Lover. And this was a soldier in the French Zouave Legion, and you can tell that from the symbol up here, the crescent moon and the star. And he called him the Lover. His real name was Lieutenant Millier, because he was a very great hit with the ladies of Arles. And Vincent was rather jealous of him and said, yes, but he may be able to do that, but I can paint, he said. And if he could paint, he wouldn't have all those girlfriends. So there was this sort of rather bantering relationship between the two of them. But Millier was a great friend of Vincent's and would go on walks across the landscape with him to some of his painting motifs a bit later on. And here is Vincent striding out up the road to Tarascon. Here's a little drawing he did. That may or may not be a self-portrait. But here is the road that leads out of Arles up the Avenue de Montmajour, due north to Tarascon. And here he is depicting himself with all his painting gear, all his materials, a canvas under his arm, his colours and his stool on his back, maybe a little easel here, a walking stick, and so on. So this is the artist on his way out to work one morning. And this is a very famous image, but it doesn't exist anymore. It was presumably lost by fire in 1945, although there's no absolute proof of that. And there is just a sort of faint possibility that it did survive the war, but it's never been seen since. And when he got to Montmajour, this hillside, this rocky promontory on which the abbey was located, he would stand on the top of the hillside and he would look around, this great panoramic view, and he would look to the east, he'd look to the south, he'd look to the west, and he'd draw principally first the views that he saw from that location. So this is looking slightly, let's just show you the map again. So this is looking from the Abbey of Montmajour to the Mont des Cordes there. So he's looking southeast. And so this is the Mont des Cordes here, this little promontory. Arles is over here to the right. There's the Mont des Cordes, and the village of Fontvieille, where the artist's village is over here on the left. So he's making a very careful drawing of the scene that he sees. And he's using all these wonderful drawing materials that he's really mastered over the previous 3 or 4 years, especially the reed pen and the ordinary pen. And a lot of these marks here are made with this extraordinary instrument that he perfected the use of like no other artist ever has, the reed pen. Here he's looking straight across the crow. It's slightly to the right of the previous painting, drawing, I'm sorry. And here's the Mont des Cordes here, and he's looking a little bit further round to the side here, and Arles will be over here, although he doesn't depict it. But here he's just got behind a wonderful a tree on the hillside of Montmajour. And here he's looking directly at Arles. He's looking southwest off the top of Montmajour, and he's looking across the plain to Arles itself. And here is just a very sketchy one, but you can see a few spires on the horizon there. But here is one of his most magnificent Arles drawings. And he's up on the rocky promontory of Montmajour, and here are the spires of Arles. And this drawing, which is now in Oslo, was the first drawing by Vincent to enter any public collection anywhere in the world. And it was bought by the National Gallery in Oslo in 1893. There was an exhibition of his work, a posthumous exhibition, and the National Gallery of Oslo bought this drawing, and it's now one of their great masterpieces. We tried to borrow it for our exhibition, but it's too fragile and too sensitive to travel. But you can enjoy it here as an image. But you can see the wonderful rocks sort of climbing down the hillside. And we haven't yet seen the ruined abbey. We'll see that shortly. So that was all happening in May of 1888. And then he stops going up to Montmajour for a while and decides that he's going to go somewhere else. So he strikes south at the very end of May and the very beginning of June and goes to Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer, that fishing village on the Mediterranean Sea. And there he paints 3 pictures, including this beautiful view of the northern prospect of the town. And by this time, he's very, very enthusiastic about the work of Cézanne. It was part of the reason why he thought he ought to go to Provence in the first place, because he admired Cézanne so much. But you can see, if you're familiar with the works of Cézanne, that this is very reminiscent of the sort of blocky constructions in sort of sand colours that Cézanne was making of his landscapes. So here's the very beautiful Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer with these wonderful lilac-coloured plants converging on the tower of the church. He loved perspective. Whenever he could produce some sort of converging orthogonals, he would do so, and he's done so here. And of course, he went round the other side of the town onto the beach, made this wonderful drawing, again in reed pen. You can see how extraordinary a technique it is. And here again, he's put in colour notes on his drawing. This is just a drawing he did in less than an hour, but he's put in the fact there's red here, and there's blue here, and there's other colours over here. And then he's gone back to his room where he's staying in Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer. These fishing boats didn't hang around long enough for him to paint them. The fishermen just got in them and sailed off early morning. So he had to go there very early in the morning to make the drawing. And then back in his hotel room, where he was lodging, he then made the painting with the colours corresponding to the colour notes, and then adding in a few extra sailboats towards the back of the composition. And by this time, we've got into June, and it's harvest time in Provence. And he then produces an extraordinary series of harvest pictures. And this is the great masterpiece of them all. It's called The Harvest, or The Blue Cart. It's the great prospect from just outside Arles, looking across the plain of the Crau, all the way across there to the Alpil Mountains here. That's that range of low mountains to the northeast of Arles, and here on its rocky promontory is Montmajour, the ruined abbey. And so that is the place where he would walk to, and which we've been talking about just now. So this is a great masterpiece, which he was so pleased with that he reproduced it himself in a series of drawings. This is actually this is done as a study for this. This is a preparatory drawing, which is now in the Fogg Art Museum. And you can see it's a study because there are various figures in the final painting which don't appear in the study. So this is a study of the landscape, but he's not included this figure here. He's not included that harvest wagon with a horse there. So this is just a study of the landscape in which he was going to include other figures, such as this wagon and horses there too. So this is a preparatory study, but this one coming up is a drawing after the painting. And he did several of these, which he sent to his friends because he was so pleased with the composition. And this one he sent to an American painter called John Russell, and he sent another one to Émile Bernard, his friend. There's a series of these drawings after the painting, which he did quite deliberately as sort of mementos of the painting. And at the same time, also in June of 1888, sorry it's a little bit blurred, I took this one in the Kröller-Müller Museum with the Kröller-Müller frame, but this is the famous Sower. And the significance of this is not only that it's one of the great harvest paintings where the harvest is being taken in, so there's still wheat and this extraordinary setting sun at the back, but already the sower is sowing the seed for next year's crop. So as soon as wheat fields were harvested, they would be sown again by the sowers for the following year's crop. And the significance of this painting for us here in Houston is that when Vincent sent the rocks, which we'll come back to in a moment, to his brother Theo, as he sent everything to him, he also sent in this painting of the sower, and Theo is recorded as having our painting of the rocks and the sower next to each other on his bedroom wall. So that's a wonderful juxtaposition to think about. And so he comes back from the south. It's now July of 1888, and he has another campaign of walking across the 4 miles or so to Montmajour from Arles, and he starts to make more drawings of the heights of Montmajour, and they're getting more and more ambitious. We saw just one really ambitious one, the Oslo drawing before, done in May, but now in July he's really getting to grips with Montmajour as a motif. So this is a very famous one, the Rock of Montmajour with pine trees in the Van Gogh Museum, and again it is one of these great reed pen masterpieces, featuring the great rocks of the slopes of Montmajour and the little stunted oak trees and olive trees that he saw up there. And here's another, which is in the museum in Tournai, of a similar subject, but he loves these sweeping, you can imagine the wind rustling through these branches, and you can almost sense the sort of wind rushing through the foliage here. And then now we begin to see the ruin itself. And so this is actually the ruined Abbey of Montmajour, and Arles is behind us. But here are the rocks and the actual ruins contrasted. And this is not in the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, it's actually in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. But these drawings are large, they're getting really large now, these drawings. And he does two, here's another one he does of just the ruins, which is in the Van Gogh Museum, very faded. He's used a sort of purple ink here, which has faded away to a sort of pale brown. But you can see from this drawing and from this photograph actually taken before he ever went there in 1862 by a man called Edward Baldou of the ruins itself, that he's made quite an accurate depiction of the ruins themselves. And interestingly, if we go back to that one, sorry, too far. If we go back to that one, there's a couple of little figures up here, little Arlesian women with parasols, which is a very charming detail that he's included. Maybe he just made it up, I don't know. And so here is one of the great panoramas that he made from the top of the heights of Montmajour. And he said he's very, very proud of them. Writing to his fellow painter Émile Bernard on 15th of July 1888, he says, have made large pen drawings too, and we'll see the other one in a moment, an immense flat expanse of country, seen in bird's eye from the view from the top of a hill, vineyards, harvested fields of wheat, all of it multiplied endlessly, streaming away like the surface of the sea towards the horizon, bounded by the hillocks of La Crau. It does not look Japanese, because everything had to be Japanese in Provence for Vincent, but it's actually the most Japanese thing that I've done. A microscopic figure of a ploughman over here, a little train passing through the wheat fields here. That's the only life there is in it. Listen, I passed a few days after my arrival that place with a painter friend. So he went there probably with the Danish painter that I mentioned earlier. And so he went there soon after his arrival, but it wasn't until May and then again in July that he had these great campaigns on the heights of Montmajour. And the other great panorama he does is this one, which is in the Van Gogh Museum. The previous one was in the British Museum. And here it's just the great play or interplay of fields and crops, and here's the hill, here's the Mount of Cord, which we saw earlier, and Arles is over here off to the right. So these great panoramas, and these are very large drawings indeed for him. And so we come to our painting, The Rocks, which he painted in that same campaign, July 1888, and it is, as we've now become very familiar, one part of the hillside of the Montmajour promontory. And he was very pleased with this painting, and he wrote to his friend Émile Bernard and said that I've painted this picture, which I'm very happy with, and here I send you a drawing of it. So this is a drawing that Bernard received from Vincent, which is obviously an exact copy of the painting that he's done. So we know that he was very delighted with the painting that he did. But recently, another painting has come to light. This one, which is called Sunset at Montmajour. And this has been around through the 20th century, but was rejected for many years as a genuine Van Gogh by the Van Gogh Museum and by other experts who thought it wasn't strong enough as a Van Gogh painting. But then about 3 or 4 years ago, the Van Gogh Museum took another look at it, and they consulted us because we had a painting that was probably, if this is genuine, that was painted at the same time. And so we looked at the pigments that he used in our painting, and they are identical to the pigments used in that painting. It's as if they're painted off the same palette. So obviously the distributions of pigments are very different. Ours is a much lighter area picture. This is a much denser painting, but the actual pigments in use are exactly the same. And there's a passage in a letter to Theo in July of 1888, which has always been associated with our painting. And it says, yesterday, this is a very beautiful piece of writing, yesterday at sunset I was on a stony heath where very small twisted oaks grow. In the background a ruin on the hill and wheat fields in the valley. It was romantic. The sun was pouring its very yellow rays over the bushes and the ground, absolutely a shower of gold, and all the lines were beautiful. The whole scene had a charming nobility. You wouldn't have been at all surprised to see knights and ladies suddenly appear, returning from hunting with hawks, or to hear the voice of an old Provençal troubadour. The fields seemed purple, the distances blue, and I brought back a study of it too, but it was well below what I wished to do. Now that passage in that letter of 5th of July has always been associated with our painting. And if you look at the literature before a few years ago, that passage will be connected to our picture, but it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit our picture because there is no ruins background, a ruin on the hill in our picture. There is no distant view of wheat fields and so on. And so it never quite fitted our picture. And most importantly, he says here, but it was well below what I'd wished to do. In other words, he was not satisfied with it. Of course, he was satisfied with our picture because he sent a drawing of it to Émile Bernard. He said to Émile Bernard, I really, really am proud of this painting. And so suddenly it all made sense. This passage actually relates to this painting. Here is the ruin on the hill. Here are the wheat fields in the valley. The sun is pouring over the landscape, which is not so much in our picture. And so suddenly the scholars at the Van Gogh Museum realized that actually this was the painting that he's referring to. And it's not a successful painting. It's a spectacular painting, but you can quite imagine why he might have said, but it was well below what I wished to do. And so now this particular ambiguity, we feel, has been sorted out. But it's wonderful for us here in Houston because our painting has a brother or a sister. So it's very nice. And the scholars from the Van Gogh Museum came here and they studied our picture, and we collaborated over scientific examination, and we realized that they do belong together. This is a larger painting. It's actually a larger format than ours, but they were painted within a day or two of each other, literally off the same palette. In September of 1888, he's come away from Montmajour. He actually doesn't go back there, but he's now fully occupied in Arles with a whole series of projects. And in September of 1888, the following, he's got through August and he's now into early fall, he starts to embark on a series of night pictures. And so he does these three very famous night pictures. The Night Café, which is the Café de la Gare on the Place Lamartine near the famous Yellow House. And here is the café with its extraordinary complementary colors of green and red. And he talks about this in a letter. He says green and red are the colors of passion, of violence, and he really emphasizes this extreme contrast of these two colors. He paints the Café Terrace at night, which is the Place de la Forum, which is yet another cafe in Arles, and he's made a drawing of it already in September, and then he paints the same scene. The drawing is a day scene, the painting is a night scene, and the drawing is in our exhibition here, and it's an absolutely sensational work done in reed pen, as you can see. But the Café Terrace at night, again, is an exercise in complementary colors, and he's using blue and orange here as complementary colors here to emphasize the lights in the buildings at the back there. He's beginning to discover starry nights. And so above the Café Terrace, he paints the stars, and then he does this extraordinary painting, Starry Night over the Rhone, in October, not to be confused with the famous Starry Night in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. This is another one, but it's equally wonderful and equally important. And here are the stars and the lights reflected in the River Rhone, which of course is running right through the center of Arles. Now the interesting thing is that these two, this one, are all large format canvases. He started to work on a whole series of size 30 canvases, which is quite large for him. Everything he's painted up to then has been smaller. And so these size 30 canvases are for a reason. And the reason is that he's beginning to think about the famous Yellow House. Now this is one of the most famous houses in the history of art. It is the house that he rented. He rented it from the landlord in May of 1888, used it as a studio throughout the summer, but didn't move into it and live in it until September, October 1888. but he had to do various works on it. It wasn't quite fit as a studio that he could work in, and he had to have gas lighting installed. It had no artificial lighting at all, and it's thought that these piles of earth here and this trench here are to bring a gas pipe into the yellow house so that he could have gas lighting there. Here is the Avenue de Montmajour, which we saw on the map. This is where he would have walked when he was going out on the road to Tarascon and out to Montmajour. And here is a view from the other end of that road looking back towards the yellow house. So if you can imagine yourself under that second bridge looking back towards us, this is the view you'd get. So down there on the right is the yellow house, and there's a garden in front of the yellow house here called the Place Lamartine, and you can see the sort of traces of a little garden through the railway bridge. And you can see that that bridge is arched, that bridge is flat, and here we have the flat bridge and the arched bridge there. So that's the direction we're looking. And he does a little drawing of that view for Theo on October 13th, 1888. So we can pretty much identify when he made this painting. This is the drawing of another bridge, a bridge over the Rhone, which we're not going to see in this particular context. So the yellow house is something very special because he rented it as his own studio, but he rented it for the purpose of setting up this sort of artist collaboration, this artist cooperative that he dreamed about, the studio of the South. He wanted to invite other artists down to Provence. They would paint together, they would collaborate together, they would discuss art together. And the only artist that actually responded to his call, slightly reluctantly, was Paul Gauguin. And so Gauguin was scheduled to arrive in the second part of October. And so leading up to that moment, Vincent decided that he would decorate the yellow house with a whole series of large format canvases. And that's where those other canvases came in, because they were all part of the decorative scheme for the yellow house that he was painting frantically to hang on the walls to welcome Gauguin to Arles. This was another of the paintings he did, large format for the decoration of the yellow house, the famous Tarascon stagecoach, which we have in the exhibition. And here is a letter to Theo about this novel that he wrote, that Alphonse Daudet wrote, called Tartarin de Tarascon. And he says, "Do you remember in Tartarin," that's the novel by Alphonse Daudet, "the lament of the old Tarascon diligence? That wonderful page. Well, I've just painted that red and green carriage in the yard of the inn. Here it is. You'll see, this hasty sketch gives you its composition. Simple foreground of grey sand, there. Background very simple too, pink and yellow walls, there. With windows with green louvered shutters. Corner of blue sky, up there. The two carriages very colourful. Green, red, wheels yellow, black, blue, orange, a number 30 canvas once again." And he includes this beautiful little sketch in his letter. So this is another of those decorative canvases that he's making for the yellow house. And here are three more. Two of them we have in the exhibition. We have this one and we have this one, the Green Vineyard, which is one of his most extraordinary compositions, all large format canvases. And he's painting them in September, October, before Gauguin arrives, but he carries on painting them after Gauguin arrives. So the decoration of the yellow house continues even after Gauguin is there. And this one is painted after the arrival of Gauguin, and it's a matching vineyard for the Green Vineyard, the so-called Red Vineyard there. And it's the only painting that was sold in Van Gogh's lifetime. This is just a single work, apart from things that he sent many things to Theo, but this is the only one that actually sells in his lifetime. It was bought by the sister of one of his friends, and then it was acquired by the famous Russian collector Shukin, and he took it back to Russia with him, which is why it's now in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. And so Gauguin arrives, and they get on very well. They actually collaborate from October through for about a month or two, and they collaborate on projects together. the two painters, the very different in character, the sort of alpha male Paul Gauguin, and the sort of insecure, strange, muddled, mentally disturbed Vincent, actually get on quite well, and they paint things together. They actually paint the same motifs at the same time. Here is Joseph Michel Genoux, painted by Vincent in December 1888, and he's the proprietor of the famous night cafe that we saw earlier. So he and his wife, Madame Genoux, are the proprietors of this cafe. But when Vincent is painting this portrait, Paul Gauguin is sitting beside him, and he paints the same man in the same pose, wearing the same clothes at the same moment. And there is the portrait that Gauguin paints. And you can see it is the same man, he's wearing the same things, and he's got that same pose, looking rather oddly down his nose in front of him. So you know that Gauguin is sitting slightly to the left of Vincent when he's painting this in December of 1888. The two men, the two painters, also paint the wife of Joseph Michel Genoux, and she's the famous Arlésienne. And here she is. This is the painting that Vincent did just slightly before that portrait of the husband in November of 1888. We know the exact moment that he's painting it, between November the 2nd and the 5th. And here is a later copy he makes. And he tends to make later copies of things for giving as gifts, perhaps to the sitter themselves, or to send to Theo as records of what he's done. But this is the original one he did in early November. And this is the drawing that Gauguin made at the same moment in the same pose. So here we are on November the 2nd, 1888. Vincent is painting his painting, Gauguin is drawing his drawing, and then Gauguin uses that drawing to paint his version of the night cafe over here. You can see that he's got Madame Genoux there, giving us rather a sort of sly look. But here is the night cafe in the background, the same billiard table, the same red walls that Vincent portrayed in his version. And the wonderful smoke that's going across here. And the little cat down there, just noticed that. Of course, it couldn't last. And we know that come December, relations between the two men are getting to a pretty low ebb, and they're rowing more and more about all sorts of trivial things, about their approach to art, but also about domestic things. Vincent is terribly messy, he can't cook, and Gauguin decides to do the cooking, but Vincent keeps leaving sort of squeezed out tubes of paint sort of in the food store and things like that. So the irritations grow, you know, and a lot of it's serious, but a lot of it's trivial. But in the end, in December, just before Christmas, Vincent attacks Gauguin with a razor, and but doesn't injure him, but injures himself. And of course, famously cuts off all or most of his left ear, and then is himself rushed to hospital, the hospital in Arles, the Hotel Dieu that I showed you earlier on the map, and is bandaged up, and they stem the bleeding, and this is the famous incident. Theo rushes down from Paris to be by his side. Paul Gauguin rushes in the opposite direction, and he's not very brave himself, and that's the end of Gauguin's stay in Arles, the end of the Studio of the South, the end of this great collaboration between the two painters. So Vincent is in and out of the hospital in Arles. He paints this portrait in January, just after Christmas, of himself with the bandaged ear. It's his left ear because he's looking in a mirror, so it's not. It is his left, although it appears to be right here. And this is the famous portrait that's in the Courtauld Gallery in London. And he makes a recovery, and he paints, as part of his sort of therapy, this very, very famous and important picture which we have in the exhibition, a still life with a plate of onions. And this is the first painting he makes when he's come out of the hospital in Arles and gone back to the Yellow House, now devoid of Gauguin. And this is a very symbolic picture, and we're very happy to have it here. And it has various objects in it which are very significant. Onions, which he ate every day, absinthe, which he drank every day, coffee, which he brewed every day. Here is a book about good health, which is slightly ironic in the circumstances. Here is a very significant object, which is a letter from Theo. These were arriving almost every day, but they were obviously incredibly important to Vincent. They not only brought news of Theo, they brought constant supplies of money, which of course he needed all the time. Theo has been supporting Vincent financially all this time. And there are two other things that are very important here: a pipe with tobacco and a lighted candle on the back of the table. And these represent Vincent and Gauguin, because just before this he had painted their two chairs. These are the two chairs. And so on Vincent's chair, which is in the National Gallery in London, he puts the pipe and tobacco. And on Gauguin's chair, rather more elaborate, he puts a lighted candle, which of course match up with those two symbols there in the still life. And so this is a still life lamenting the end of this relationship, lamenting the fact that the studio of the South hasn't worked, that Vincent, represented by the pipe, and Gauguin, represented by the lighted candle, have gone their separate ways. It's an extraordinarily important picture. When he's in the Arles Hospital and he goes in, he's a constant visitor. He goes in and out of the hospital. He's treated by a young house doctor called Felix Ray, this is a portrait that he did of his doctor. And you can see from a more or less contemporary photograph that the painting is quite accurate, but he's sort of slimmed down Dr. Ray's face a little. And it's said that Dr. Ray's mother hated this portrait and for a long time used it as to block up a hole in the hen house. It seems to have survived remarkably well, but this is obviously one of his very famous portraits from the Arles period. And here is the hospital in which he was treated, the Hotel Dieu that you saw on the map. Here is one of the wards with the inmates of the hospital, and here is the famous courtyard of the Hotel Dieu, the hospital in Arles. Two of his famous paintings, both now in the wonderful collection of the Reinhardt collection in Winterthur, which if you ever find yourself in Zurich, don't miss going out to Winterthur and seeing these and many other astonishing pictures by French 19th century painters. And then he makes a sort of recovery of sorts. And so by the time spring comes, he's painting again. He's going out, he's looking at the landscapes around Arles. Here is the wonderful peach trees in blossom. He's back to his blossoming orchards. And here on the horizon are those mountains of the Alpilles. And just to the left, if we could just go around a little bit to the left here, would be the promontory with the Abbey of Montmajour. So it's still there. He's not gone back to it since July. And one of his last works in Arles is this beautiful drawing of a tree in the grounds of the hospital, the weeping tree. And it's, again, one of his great masterpieces done in reed pen. And then things really conspire against him. The landlord of the Yellow House wants his house back. The inhabitants of Arles are worried about having this maniac painter in their midst and draw up a petition to the mayor to have him expelled. It's very cruel, but you could imagine how they might feel nervous about having him around with razor blades. And he decides himself to commit himself to another hospital across the Alpilles Mountains in Saint-Remy, which is just to the north of the Alpilles, to the care of doctors in the psychiatric institution of Saint Paul de Morzeau in Saint-Remy. And we know it's still there. We know where his bedroom was. We know where his studio room was. And here's a little painting he made of his studio in Saint-Remy. He went there on the 8th of May, 1889, and that was the end of his 444 days in Arles. where he painted some of his most astonishing pictures. We know, although he didn't, that he had just 14 months to live. But this is, again, he was about to embark on another amazing episode of his career, the paintings he made in Saint-Remy. But that brings us to the end of Arles, and it puts, I hope for you, our painting here in Houston in context. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a remarkable story, and really a tribute that the greatest artists continue to reveal new things to us all the time. We think we know them, but there's always something new to discover. But today was a historic moment because this is Dr. Bomford's last lecture here at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, because sometime in the next week, he and his wife, Sunny, who is here with us today, she's the senior paintings conservator here at the museum, are heading back into retirement. They're moving back to England to be with their children and their grandchildren. But what grander note to leave our museum than with an exhibition, the exhibition Vincent van Gogh, His Life in Art. People lined up out the door to see the exhibition. Literally, they were all the way down to the Hotel Zaza today and lined up beyond that. So we say, I think on behalf of all of us, thank you, David, for bringing so many of the world's great treasures to Houston. And maybe if we're really lucky, we can coax him back from time to time just to do a lecture. But thank you all for coming. Look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.